All right, just a couple words on the sacrament of penance, or also called confession or reconciliation, which all highlight different aspects of the sacrament itself. Penance, right? What is done by the penitent, the person that confesses their sin? Reconciliation, right? What happens to their relationship, or what Christ does, right? Once we show that our souls are open for forgiveness, right? Okay, cool. What do we want to say about this sacrament? Just a couple things. First of all, we've mentioned venial mortal sin, right? Venial being lesser sins that don't totally sever the relationship, but simply damage it in a little way, right? And mortal sins, which are conscious, grave sins with full consent that totally sever our relationship. Um, when that happens, the relationship with Christ, right? When that happens, there needs to be a formal thing to reconcile the relationship once again. We need to go to reconciliation, the sacrament, to bring the relationship back together. Why? Because in baptism, right, we receive the grace of forgiveness of sins. But us sinners, we sin after baptism, which means we reject the grace that we received at baptism. So what now? What happens when we reject Christ's salvation, right? That's where reconciliation comes in, right? It's the offering of grace to bring us back into communion with Christ and His church. Okay? So, what do we see in the early church? We see this often. We see St. John talking about the need to confess sins to one another. We see St. James talk about it. We see Paul talking about confessing with our lips and not just our hearts, right? And we see Christ giving the authority for the forgiveness of sins to the apostles. On the day of the resurrection, he says, whose sins you forgive are forgiven, and whose sins you retain are retained. In other words, God has the authority to forgive sins. God gives that authority to the apostles. So that's handed on to the church, to the bishops, and the priests, right? And the church, they continue with that authority for the forgiveness of sins. Okay, we also see it when Christ tells Saint Peter, right, you are rock, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound, whatever you loose shall be loosed. Right, that same idea. Okay, so what do we see? We see the authority to forgive sins. Well, since the apostles are humans, right, and if they want to exercise the authority Christ gave them in God's name and not to abuse it, right? They're not just going to start handing out forgiveness of sins just to anybody. Say, oh, John Smith, you're cool. I'll forgive your sins. Or abuse it in the way of somebody saying, hey, let me give you some money, right? And in doing so, right, why don't you forgive my sins, right? But what do we see, right? If Christ gives the authority of the apostles to do it in His name, well, they should do it with Christ's intention, right? For those that desire forgiveness and have the contrition and to have the heart for it. Well, so if they want to do it, right, since they're not omniscient, what does that mean? All-knowing, right? Since they're not all-knowing, they need to hear, right, the sins, which is why Paul says, confess your sins with your lips, right? While James says, confess your sins to one another. While John talks about confessing sins, right? Why? Because in order for them to act out the authority Christ gives, they have to know what the sins are to be able to forgive them, right? So from the very beginning, there are four main aspects, right, of this sacrament that Christ institutes. What's there from the very beginning? Okay, 3 come from the part of the sinner, and 1 from the part of the authority of Christ. The 3 that come from the sinner, let me erase this and start again. The 3 that come from the penitent, the sinner, the confessor, right? He must confess, right? What's always true when it comes to our relationship with Christ, Christ knows our souls, right? And that's what grace is all about, right? And that's what sins is all about. So also contrition, right? One truly has to have sorrow, right? There's not faking out God. There's not some magic trick. Let me just say something and it's done, right? But there has to be true sorrow. There has to be a reality in the soul and in the heart of turning away from sin, okay? And lastly, there has to be, right, the retribution or the reparation or the penance itself, right? The penance itself, what the person does, right? That's all on the side of the penitent. On the side of Christ and His authority, the priest acting in the person of Christ, with Christ's authority, he gives absolution, which is the authority of Christ to absolve sins, right? To forgive. The forgiveness of sins, okay? That forgiveness of sins, what does it do, right? It brings one back into, is the grace to bring one back into relationship with Christ and his body, which is what? The church, right? Make sure we've got that down. Okay. Also, what does it do? It forgives the eternal punishment for sin. What is that? Hell, right? And lastly, right, what does it forgive? Maybe at least part of temporal punishment. What does that mean? The wounds that happen, right? The relationship's damage. So to get rid of some of that damage, right? Doing penance to right the wrong, to bring it back into relationship, right? At least part. And lastly, the guilt of the sin itself. Forgives the sin itself, okay? All right, main parts. Now, one last thing to say. Two forms that we've seen in the church. From the very beginning, you have those four parts. But what do? They took it very seriously. And they took the sinfulness very seriously. And Christ's authority to forgive sins very seriously. So it wasn't given out too often. So confession in the early church was public. It was serious. And penance may have taken years, along with the fact you may only be able to receive the sacrament, and the priest may only exercise his authority to forgive sins once in a lifetime at the beginning, right? How that changes through the great Irish monks, thank goodness, right? They brought up private and frequent confession, right? That's good, right? Good for us. And we can see in both of these, take the time, think about, brainstorm the advantages or the positives and negatives for each one. And each one of these has positives and negatives. Think about if confession was still the only way we receive the grace of forgiveness after baptism. Would we confess our sins publicly? We spend 3 years in penance, public penance, and we only receive it once or twice. What would that do? What would be the positives? What would be the negatives, right? And same thing with this one, positives and negatives. Take the time to think about that. That, in a nutshell, is penance and how it goes through to today.